Hi, I'm Lars-Erik Lundin and welcome to this podcast trying to shed some light on an issue which is being discussed at most breakfast tables around the world currently, at least in Sweden and Europe, and that is the risk of escalation of the war in Ukraine, the unprovoked aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. For many, this is an issue of the potential use of nuclear weapons in sub-strategic ones in Ukraine, but as we that is Michael, Sahlin and myself, will try to illustrate in this podcast, it is a much more complex and wide and diverse issue than a matter of nuclear weapons. Escalation can take place in many different ways and is dependent upon many different things. We start the podcast with a general overview by Michael Sahlin, and then we go from the perspective of Sweden and Finland joining NATO and Sweden holding the rotating presidency of the EU during the first half year of 2023, and then we move on to different aspects of escalation, escalatory threats as discussed by the NATO Secretary General, by the Swedish Commander-in-Chief and others, moving on to how escalation is being seen as a necessary element for Ukraine to win the war and as a threat, of course, to looking at it from the perspective of deterrence, looking at it from the perspective of the Russian Federation, of establishing red lines which don't hold, etc., etc. And of course, from the perspective of civil society, where the Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize laureates of this year are of course fighting for freedom and indeed victory of Ukraine, for freedom in Belarus, for freedom in Russia, which in itself requires additional efforts, both in military and other ways. So I hope that, and we hope that this podcast will help you to orient yourself in a very wide and unfortunately complex terrain of existential importance for us all. Welcome. Michael, we are now resuming our podcasts that we used to do relatively regularly during the previous period of drafting books. We have written together several books about the southern dimension of European security, about the situation in terms of security policy before the 24th of February, and you have been, but we have both been heavily involved in the production of a book about the situation partially after, in terms of when it comes to Swedish security policy. So today we have agreed to make a podcast about a very topical issue in the debate right now for obvious reasons, the risk of escalation of the war in Ukraine in different ways. I have taken the liberty to start collecting some material in the form of sort of a mind map, where I found a lot of articles on the risk of accidental escalation, including close to our borders in the Baltics, escalation inside Ukraine, of course, horizontal escalation beyond the issue of areas close to the Ukraine borders, but also in other dimensions, such as hybrid dimensions, the effective results of military aid and relation to escalation, the critical issue of nuclear escalation risks, possible use of nuclear weapons, the question of de-escalation and negotiations, and of course, views of major actors on the escalation, including Scholz in Germany, the US president, the UK, France, etc. So it's a very, very extensive debate, not very conclusive. There are different views, some focusing on the need for de-escalation negotiations, others focusing on the need to secure Ukraine victory. So what is your impression of the debate in general, yourself?
My impression of the debate is that it is very tentative. It shows that we are in the stage of terra incognita, unknown territory. It is a unique situation in the both not only post-Cold War period, but also post-Second World War period. And actors and debaters are characterized by a great amount of anxiety before the unknown, since everyone is somehow concerned with not having a clue about what could the end game be on this. And therefore, what would be the kind and degree of further escalation be, and what are the risks involved? We have seen, both of us, and discussed statements made by Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO chief, saying and warning against this situation, against the best wishes of all of us, further escalating into a more full-scale war between Russia and NATO. And of course, this will involve Swedish security and Finnish security enormously now that we are going to be members of NATO. And therefore, the Swedish Supreme Commander was similarly expressing concerns at the unknown but threatening further de-escalation of this without any knowledge on the part of anyone when it comes to how can an outcome of this be, and what will the further action and reaction theme be now that the West or the US is announcing probable decision this week or next to deploy Patriots into territory of Ukraine, and now that Russia is threatening or pledging to add a further wave of mobilization, adding 200,000 troops, and that this causes the Ukraine government in turn to say that we are expecting a new offensive from Russia, maybe as early as January. So no doubt there is a great amount of both uncertainty but also anxiety on the part of main leaders now, because the end game of this is still unknown.
Yeah. So against the backdrop of both the image of all the articles and debate elements that's out there, and what you just said as an overall summary, and putting the whole thing into context now, we are going to make a little bit more systematic run through of the various elements. Will not be a complete picture, of course, but it will include, it will give hopefully you as a viewer or listener an idea of the scope of this debate, which is much wider than one would have thought. I mean, you might think that escalation is, okay, will there be a use of nuclear weapons or not? But in fact, escalation is a much wider issue. Escalation has been going on for quite some time and will probably continue for some time further. And we are situating this presentation now in the context of the fact that Sweden is on its way, together with Finland, into NATO, and is for the 6 coming months holding the rotating presidency of the European Union. So it's a very crucial time for Sweden in terms of its reorientation of its security policy externally, and at the same time implementing a dramatic increase of its defense budget and re-establishment of a civil defense, which has been successively built down since the end of the Cold War. So it's a really historic changes that we are witnessing. So I'll just give you an overview picture now of the presentation that we will do, and then we will focus on the individual boxes in this. But first, Michael, you wanted to add something.
This is the concept of gray area. You will come back to this, but I would like to mention it initially as a point of departure for us. The concept of gray area has been coined in defense planning circumstances for quite some years now, pointing in planning terms to the existence perhaps of a condition of not peace, sort of normal peace, nor full-scale war, something in between, which in an era where there are other means of hostility than conventional or nuclear war, you have hybrid methods, you have cyber methods of aggression, which render the concept of deterrence more difficult in view of the anonymity of the actor, and therefore complicating deterrence. Now it seems that in the planning halls of Sweden, launching, for example, a defense planning commission again, the concept of gray area has taken on a new status. We are saying that we are now in such a gray area of in between full-scale war and normal peace. I say normal peace, meaning the way we understood the word peace in the post-Cold War era. And this provides us, Lars-Erik, with a very important, I think, an interesting point of departure. Where are we now?
So I put that in the map here. So what you see in front of you is simply the map without any ingredients for the time being, where you can see Ukraine more or less in the center, but where you also see that Sweden and Finland and Norway together, they occupy quite a substantial part of this European map, almost half of the north-south distance. And as has been mentioned by the Swedish government recently, the hostilities in Ukraine are some, not too far from Sweden. It's about a little bit more than the distance between Stockholm and Malmö. So it's not a huge distance that we have to this war. It may seem far away sometimes, but in reality, I think most Swedes have learned to understand that the war has come much closer to us. So
I think we should add here also that this illustrates the consequence of NATO enlargement, adding relevant territory, adding a long border stretch to what NATO has been defending so far, which highlights the significance of this step of NATO enlargement.
Absolutely, and it's really a huge. So it complicates defense for NATO, but it adds also enormous assets, in fact, particularly when it comes to Air Force assets already now existing in the northern area.
And it affects the character of the Baltic Sea becoming more or less...
Mare Nostrum for NATO, almost. So that's... at the same time, you see the Russian Navy and the Black Sea being threatened. So there are significant geopolitical, geostrategic changes underway in Europe, which obviously are perceived as threatening in Russia. So the topic of this presentation is the risk of escalation of the Russian war against Ukraine. The point of departure, going to the middle of the screen here, is that Sweden and Finland are on their way into NATO at the period of heightened tension and war in Europe. And the fact that we are on our way into NATO is not, of course, then not a coincidence, but it's a development which has culminated with 24th of February that really has made this move absolutely necessary, which has convinced the Swedish population to a very large extent of the necessity of this, following a similar move in Finland, of course, which came before us.
And here, Lars-Erik, we have an example of a concept pair that we have been working on in earlier publications, namely the concepts of action, reaction, and the dynamics characterized by process of action and reaction. And in this case, it is Sweden and Finland reacting to the Russian statements 1 year ago concerning their view of security architecture, and then followed up by the Russian aggression against Ukraine, leaving Sweden and Finland with no choice but to go all the way in a process that has been going on for many years, and then applying for full membership.
So I added that box here as well. And we note then immediately that the war is escalating in different ways. You mentioned the existing of a gray zone between war and peace, which has been adopted, the perspective which have been adopted by the Defense Planning Commission. On the Russian side, it has, of course, been argued that war has been underway for a considerable period in different dimensions. And in this war, different types of weapons have been used, including hybrid ones. But also, importantly, it is perceived on the Russian side that NATO and EU enlargement is a part of this hostile action against the Russian Federation. You mentioned also that the NATO Secretary General, and echoing him, the Swedish Commander-in-Chief, are on record warning against the further escalation to weapons of mass destruction. This is something which was explicitly said by the Swedish Commander-in-Chief when he was asked, escalation, what do you mean? Well, I mean weapons of mass destruction. It doesn't have to be nuclear, it could also be chemical. And of course, chemical that reminds, or biological that reminds of the fact that we are not just necessarily talking about weapons of mass destruction in terms of huge destruction of critical infrastructure or masses of human lives, but also selective use of weapons of mass destruction, for instance, poisoning individuals and so on.
Yeah, and of course, when we talk about escalation, as we will come into a bit later, has other dimension to it than escalating means of warfare. It could also be territorial escalation. And
I tried to illustrate that already when referring to the literature, that there are different perspectives of one may think that it's only a question of escalation inside Ukraine, but it can also be to other countries, and it can be in other dimensions than geographic, and can also be a virtual escalation. There are different domains of security policy here involved. And so this certainly, as you already mentioned, has a close relationship to the process of EU and NATO enlargement, where Sweden has this role, as I mentioned, of rotating presidency now, being an important actor in managing the process of enlargement of the EU, where Ukraine and Moldova are now important targets for integration. Whereas on the other hand, we are more of subjects or objects of what NATO members feel about our integration into the NATO as an alliance, where Turkey and Hungary currently are slowing down this process of integration, which almost is complete in terms of ratification of our accession instrument. And this obviously has to do with something that you are strongly engaged both analyzing the motives of Turkey and Swedish position vis-a-vis Turkey. Hungary, what are the motives there, which are also closely related to its situation inside EU. I don't know if you want to say something already here about those two actors. I mean,
I could say a few words about that at this stage, because I see those issues, the question of Hungary and the question of Turkey, both still today not having ratified the Swedish-Finnish applications. And invitee status, I should add, for NATO membership, making it possible and imperative for those two countries, Finland and Sweden, to be busy preparing for the full membership, preparing politically and especially militarily and in civilian defense in all sorts of ways, such that once it is clarified that all hindrances are gone, then we will be instantly ready for full membership. And I think everyone has an eye on the Vilnius summit of NATO in July this summer as a key point, similar to the way the Madrid summit was a key to allowing this process of integration that we have been preparing so long. I see that Hungary in its way and Turkey in its way are examples of threats to cohesion within NATO and EU in parallel. And this I see as one of the big issues or big challenges before looking into the future, when it is so important that the West as a whole sticks together and can act in a unitarian unity way against threats both from Russia and beyond, in fact. So these are new and old reminders of all the work that still needs to be done in order to build confidence and build cooperativeness in the West. I say the West as a concept for covering the whole, meaning EU and NATO in various ways. Hungary has a problematic role in the EU especially, and Turkey not being a member of the EU, but being a full member of NATO since 1952, Turkey is a problematic member but still a member, and therefore we as newcomers into NATO must find a way to deepen relations, deepening also understanding for what security means for this fringe country of let's say of Europe. So it's going to be a very interesting analytically and demanding politically process of handling both the EU hat as presidency and at the same time and in parallel deal with the outstanding hindrances to Hungarian and Turkish acceptance of us as an example of their general acceptance of NATO's open door policy, but they have their own sort of domestic problems to be building into this. So I'm just pointing to a very challenging parallel process in the spring.
Can we not say now that the debate around the enlargement of NATO when it comes to Sweden and Finland has shifted in the recent period from initially focusing on the benefits that Sweden and Finland would get as members of NATO to more and more focusing on the ongoing reform of NATO structures, command organization, the relationship between Brunsum and the command in the UK, etc. All of these organizational processes which are underway in NATO obviously are slowed down because of the lack of ratification of the finance here. And this, of course, obviously serves Russian interests. We have to be transparent and clear about the fact that the current slowdown is not in the interest of NATO, and that has been relatively clearly said, not least by Secretary of State Blinken recently, that NATO needs to have this process finalized very soon in order to be able to continue to beef up its organization in the case of a possible horizontal escalation of the conflict.
Yeah. there has been a clear trend since the Madrid summit of all 28 NATO countries. Hungary is a special case, and I will come back to Hungary in a moment. But to say state support for our membership, not because of us so much as because of the needs of NATO, to have us add capacities, add geography, etc., in the overall defense against Russian aggression. And that is the overriding concern here. So from the point of view of Sweden and Finland, we have been keen to respond to this by stating our readiness, not just to receive the security guarantees from a NATO membership, but also to provide assets to and capacities to the combined NATO roles in various ways. And you're so right in also pointing to the reforms going on and the adaptations within NATO organizationally to sharpen its capacity to and the will to resist further Russian aggression. And that brings us back to the escalation issue, by the way.
Yeah.
So I can only conclude on this point that this is a very interesting next 6 or 7 months that we are facing now.
So obviously some would argue that if we get more time before the Swedish and Finnish accession, that will also slow down the inevitable reaction from the Russian side, or delay reaction from the Russian side, and give us more chance to prepare for that reaction, whatever it will entail. On the other hand, it's clear that the NATO reform needs clarity about, for instance, the organization of the commands in relation to Swedish territory, whether Sweden would be part of one or divided between two commands in NATO and so on, and how the different air forces will be organized in. And we are talking about very potent air force capabilities in the north, with 3 countries opting for F-35, and Sweden having, of course, a very potent air force already based upon interoperable assets with Gripen and so forth. So now the escalation will mean, of course, that one has to analyze the resources at the disposal of the Russian Federation in order to respond. And here it's clear that, and there is already a lot of speculation, perhaps not always based on substance, in the media about how much resources Russia has at its disposal or can mobilize in order to further escalate. We have.
Before you continue, Lars-Erik, I would like to comment on that box about, because it does say respond to further escalatory efforts in the West or by the West. Of course, as we have seen in the debate and from information from various capitals, the dilemma of the West all along has been how to support Ukraine in its defense against Russian aggression without providing or giving it an escalatory function. This has been seen to be the dilemma, and this is the main thread of this whole conversation that we are having now, how to avoid contributing to further escalation if you can, while continuing and deepening your support for Ukraine in its defense. So you have the question here also of what is defensive and what is offensive. Yeah, and that's another key concept that we have been spending a lot of time with before.
And the what is often forgotten when you talk about military assistance, in this case to Ukraine, is that it enables Ukraine to do things that it otherwise could not do. So when you mention Patriot and so forth, and when one could mention what Elon Musk has done in order to help Ukraine to communicate despite interrupted telecommunications and so forth through Starlink, you're actually talking about enabling Ukraine to escalate, because Ukraine Ukraine is clearly escalating the war into Russian territory, and of course to annex Ukraine territory, including Crimea here. And they couldn't do it if they hadn't had the essential technical support from the West to do that. And of course here the United States has been careful, other countries have been less careful, but from a Russian perspective, it is seen as escalation.
You have seen a tendency in NATO for some countries, mainly those that are immediate neighbors of Russia, to be expressing themselves more sort of activistically or offensively than others. So there is a function here of the further away from Russia, the less activist you are in the views of what the West needs to do here. But since you mentioned Elon Musk, I also have to sort of point out that we have this the paradox in a way that the same Elon Musk now in ownership of Twitter, linking him to Donald Trump. And then you have on that part of the spectrum, you have the big questions about Quo Vadis US in all this. And we are entering now at the same time into a new post-midterm election period in the West, where the Republicans dominate now, although with a small narrow the House, and they have been sort of questioning. Some of them have been questioning whether the degree of support for Ukraine that the Biden administration has carried out so far has been, at least they are questioning how sustainable that is. And then that brings us to the question of uncertainties within the West and the question of sustainability of the efforts as the war in Ukraine drags on.
So that's when you say that Ukraine must win, the question is what does that mean? I mean, because that's in order to get there, you need to escalate the efforts, obviously, and you need to try to drain the Russian resources in different ways. And here the EU plays an important role. The number of sanctions, currently we have 9 sanctions packages. There will soon be more, I think. We have price caps on energy. We have a diversification of energy supplies. We have also difficulty on the Russian side to get spare parts, where not only countries but also the EU has a role. You have the need for Russia to replenish its supply of ammunition in order to. I mean, there have been a maximum figure I heard was about 60,000 shells in one single day. So they have not only the West have a problem in terms of ammunition, also Russia has a problem. We don't know how serious it is. We know that on Russian soil, the Ukraine use of drones, long-range drones and so on, has made it clear that Russia has no sanctuary anymore within 300, 400, 500 kilometers of the border to Ukraine. No sanctuary for ammunition depots or training grounds or command centers. So all this is very dangerous for Russia, puts limitations on what they can do in order to prepare for this offensive that you mentioned before. We have the question of casualties, low morale. Newly mobilized soldiers are suffering, of course, in the trenches now, very close to the picture one has from the First World War of trenches in France. So it's very different from the Ukraine mobilization, which has gone over 8 years, where they have, of course, been able to prepare themselves for winter conditions much better than these newly mobilized Russian soldiers.
I would like to add 2 aspects here, unless I'm interrupting you from a sort of a line.
No, that's it.
And that is on the one hand, we're talking here in a sort of balanced way of the mutual degree of suffering and losses on the two sides. We lack information largely about the Ukrainian side. They have decided to look upon this as a question of national sort of secrecy, how big the losses have been. It is understandable by the West, of course, that they look upon it this way, but it doesn't help us analysts to fully understand what is the degree and the toll of this war. But it is so important to have a deepened understanding of what is the cost, what is the toll of this war as we measure capacities on the part of the two sides to continue with this war, because that somehow gives us a basis for assessing at least how long could it last and what could be the outcome. I would also add, since you again mentioned Hungary, that they accepted in the EU summit the other day to not any longer veto or block the sanctions package as conceived by the Commission, which was part of a provisional deal with Hungary, between Hungary and the Commission, concerning funds to be put at the use for Hungary, much needed, because Hungary is so exposed to the energy crisis, because it doesn't have much of its own and it's completely dependent on deliveries from Russia, and therefore they are reluctant to be part of sanctions policies, etc. So it's an example of what it takes and what the degree of seriousness concerning keeping the West together, and the West including Hungary. And therefore, I think that with this agreement now, there is not any longer any political hindrance, if there ever was one, for Hungary to ratify the Swedish-Finnish application for membership. Problem now is that the Hungarian Parliament reconvenes only on February 20, which brings us deep into springtime, spring semester, before a Hungarian ratification can take place, which is a complication in combination with this Turkish problem.
Yeah, exactly. And then we come back to the issue of deterrence, because obviously the calculation on the Russian side must have been that their capabilities on the nuclear level should have discouraged the West from supporting Ukraine on a big time level, so to say. That's what was clearly their hope. This is now slowly being eroded, this deterrence effect. And if you talk about patriots and so on, you are now coming close to a situation which the Americans were not at all contemplating at the beginning of the war. So there is a steady erosion of the deterrence effect on the Russian side. They are obviously also faced with the situation that even if they have formally annexed the territories into the Russian Federation, this has in no way diminished the Ukraine war efforts inside Ukraine territory, including the annexed territories, and even allowed the Ukrainians to go into Russian territory, although this has been not done in a very open way. So the Ukraine morale, as we have several indications of this very recently, or from Swedish news reports on the ground in Kiev and Kharkiv and others, that the general impression is that the morale is very, very high, and that the use of sub-strategic nuclear weapons on Ukraine soil has not sunk in as a major threat, which has reduced morale.
And here, Lars-Erik, if I may here just say that the question of deterrence is an enormously important discourse now as we face the future. You could discuss this in various ways. Has nuclear deterrence worked, or has it not worked? And there you can apply different kinds of arguments, as we have seen in the literature. But clearly on this point, when Putin decided to launch the annexation part of the whole oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk, many could see this as an attempt to draw a red line, and then referring to the doctrine of Russia, saying that when there is a clear threat to the existence of the country, meaning open attack, then that realizes the nuclear option. There have been sort of references made to it, but that has, as you say, been now eroded. Their bluff has been called of sorts.
Yeah. So the bottom line when it comes to nuclear weapons is, according to Western commentators, experts on nuclear weapons, is that substitute nuclear weapons are not really useful from a military point of view. That's why they were taken away from Europe, from a level of almost 7,000, I think, tactical nuclear weapons on the NATO side were removed from Europe. Clearly demonstrates that if NATO had thought that those would have been militarily important for NATO, they would have been kept to a larger extent. They are not. Russia.
But Lars-Erik, the question now is: will NATO rethink this now or not? The way the Ukraine war has evolved, we'll see.
We will see, but it's very difficult to see what military difference as such, unless it is an effect, gives a serious effect on morale. Then, of course, it might be important. Now, on the other hand, the Russian threat perceptions are, according to their commentators on the media, are elevated when it comes to threats against even Moscow has been mentioned. I've seen TV programs in Russia where they mention the likelihood or possibility that Russia will be hit by conventional weapons from Ukraine in the coming period. And we have the immediate threats against the Russian presence in Crimea, with the Black Sea fleet already having been decimated. Of the flagship Moskva is, of course, a major blow to Russia and the future of the Black Sea fleet. And maybe you want to say something about that, since you have been working a long time on trying to draw attention to the importance of the Black Sea in this whole picture. I mean, all of this must be perceived as rather threatening from the Russian perspective.
Yes, and the question of the Black Sea and the balance of forces in that is one of the unknown consequences still to be foreseen from the Ukraine war development, and it involves Turkey enormously, and that's why also Turkey's importance generally as a NATO member, but a NATO member with ambitions to be strategically autonomous in its way in order to react in a relevant way to the historical and geographical facts of this country. So it's a very tricky balancing game for NATO and for the US and for the EU, of course, to balance the importance of Turkey because of its difference in many ways to mainstream NATO. So the Black Sea correlation of forces it will be dependent on the outcome also of current discussions about the Montreal Convention from 1936, which regulated the entry into and exit from the Black Sea through the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, the Turkish Straits. And there you have the role of Turkey as the owner of that convention in many ways, but with some restrictions under that convention. But it has made Turkey decide to close the straits from military passage of belligerency, Ukraine and Russia, and then you have the fact that the grain, the enormous wheat and barley, etc., and other agricultural products from the big fields of Ukraine and also Russia, and their exit to world markets and to feed the famine-threatened countries in East Africa, etc. This has taken the crisis even more to a global level than needed to have been the case, and therefore involves other players, but the West versus Russia. So enormous implications, and how Russia will act in terms of escalation of this conflict. Responding to perceived threats from the West to its Black Sea fleet. There has been mentioned, for example, that there could be a big sort of conventional Western attack on its fleet, and if that were to happen in response to something, then Russia would be very vulnerable to the capacities of the West in those terms. But it takes moving the whole situation from peacetime regulations to something else, and that largely depends on decisions by Turkey, and secondarily to the other Black Sea littoral states, Bulgaria, Romania, Georgia, and of course Ukraine and Russia. So I mean, there is a lot of developments there that could be part of our discussion now, which is what could be the quality and direction of further escalation.
Yeah. So you constantly have to balance the natural wish for victory or progress on the battlefield with the risk of escalation, yes. Where clearly Crimea has a different quality than the Donbass region.
Yes.
Now, and in the wider picture, of course, of deterrence and preventing the escalation, you have also on the global level what has happened after high-level contacts between Germany and China, for instance, with Scholz's visit to China and the G20 meeting and the declaration on nuclear weapons. First made by the P5 permanent members of the Security Council in the beginning of the year, and then repeated by the G20 countries in more or less silently witnessed by Russia. All of this has to do with what are the strategic interests of China and India here, and other major actors. We know from a recent vote in the UN that China and India are still performing a strategic balancing act vis-a-vis the conflict. China is even some ways supporting Ukraine. They are clear on the nuclear issue, but they are much less clear when it comes to more specific UN votes, where China tends to sometimes even align with Russia against the rest of at least against the West. So if you look at the map, again, obviously the fact that there is a war going on affecting a large part of the north-south distances through Europe means that China has had much more difficulties to come through with its transports, its Belt and Road policies towards the West, and there is a threat here for Russia, for Chinese plans for its Belt and Road policies over the long term if this war continues too long. Yeah. On the other hand, of course, China has, and so does India, strategic interest to align with Russia in exploiting the Arctic situation due to the climate change. So there are mixed motives here in this strategic balancing act, but there are there's certainly a restraining factor on Russian willingness to escalate here.
You could add also here that, of course, there has been ongoing for some time a US-led Western effort to mobilize support for its perception of this conflict to be one of much larger scope than simply a sort of an intra-European thing that others can ignore or try to stay out of for the time being, seeing who prevails. So one thing is, of course, U.S. policies in vis-a-vis and in support of. Currently, for example, even Japan is talking about adding to its defense budgetary constraints of the constitutionally of the past, and now they're talking about increasing to the NATO-specific 2% of GDP, and the GDP in Japan, of course, is a large sum, like in Germany. So 2% means a lot of defense budgetary allocations. So interestingly, so Japan, I don't know, I don't have current figures about South Korea, but you and I saw an article only yesterday concerning what this AUKUS agreement between UK, US, and Australia means in terms well beyond the nuclear submarine area to much wider issues. I mean, so there's a lot of things going on. And meanwhile, also the US policy has been one also to try to mobilize support for African countries. So there was only the other day a US summoned session in Washington with quite a number of African heads of state even convening or being summoned by the US in their attempt to mobilize support. So there is a global struggle for the souls of the countries in relation to this conflict.
No, and then of course, when you mentioned the United States, it must have been a big disappointment what came out of the midterm elections for Russia, that Biden was able to keep control over the Senate. And on top of this, the apparent failure of Trump, for the time being at least, to withstand the tendency for the Republican voters to think in support of Trump's policies or attitudes, but wishing for having someone else than Trump representing those DeSantis, who's now overtaken Trump in the polls. So timing is important here. What is the window open to Russia here? How much time do they have actually to change the situation to somewhat more favorable to them? We don't know, but the US situation is obviously key here, since the US in any case is providing the bulk of the support to Ukraine militarily.
Clearly so, and as I said before, as we enter into the next year, the Republicans will be in the majority of the House, and if this will change the situation concerning the willingness to continue in an endurable way, once they see that this war is not going to end anytime soon, then this will have a huge impact. And of course, there is a lot of potential for further polarization in the US policy, because the January 6th Commission is now about to issue its recommendations to the Ministry of Justice, and whether they recommend it to persecute Donald Trump, which will enrage his base politically and frighten other Republicans. So there's a lot of drama still to be expected in US policies as from now until the next election.
And now when when we then move to the concluding questions here on this podcast, what kind of escalation do we, at the minimum, foresee? And I say at the minimum because, of course, we cannot exclude weapons of mass destruction either. I think we, at least, it's without too much speculation, I think we can expect some sort of, if Russians find some way of disturbing critical infrastructure in Europe, having selective attacks, supporting attacks, maybe on individuals through using proxies like terrorists, using new forms of Wagner Group formations. I think we need to be aware of the risk of increased cyber attacks, different things that might mean a disturbance of our civil society functioning. If they can do it in a deniable way, then of course it might be an option for Russians to escalate in a horizontal fashion, as long as, I would argue, this doesn't strengthen Western morale substantially, because then it would be, of course, counterproductive from the Russian perspective.
Okay. Now continue, please.
No. So I think that what the EU means and NATO means here is it's really this 360. If the Russians have a 360-degree threat perception, then we need to promote a 360-degree awareness of that threats may come from different directions here, also from the south. There's been explicitly mentioned that Russia might wish to promote further migration crises by disturbances, of course, in the south. So resilience is important for us. It's important to quickly move forward beyond organizational discussions about civil defense to actual, I would say, urgent action in Sweden and other countries to beef up civil defense. I don't at all exclude that we might come into a crisis management mode here sooner or later, where we, just as we did during the pandemic, are forced to constantly inform the Swedish public and work together on the European level to manage different ongoing attacks against critical infrastructure and so forth. We know that we have problems with energy here. We might have further problems like Nord Stream, the Nord Stream example.
Yeah. Lars-Erik, let me comment on this. I think there is two things to add on this point, to what you said and to what is stated in the picture. One is that concerning the nature of the crisis, in an earlier slide you had the term proxy war, and I would like to expand on that concept because you could say that as has been the case in so many other conflicts, less central to world peace than the current one, to see that the proxy war has become a constant feature in the crisis in Syria and in Libya, or what have you, Afghanistan, that you have local partners, parties to the conflict, and then you have their supporting structures, and then somehow the growing vested interest on the part of those supporting persons to at least see to it that the other side does not win. And that in that sort of process of stiffening of the conflict with local parties to the conflict, and then being supported by their supporting structures, with an increasingly entrenched interest in seeing to it at least that the other side does not win, and therefore and this is mutual. It becomes a sort of a growing thing. In this case now with Ukraine, you could of course say that this is a proxy war, at least in the Russian perception, because it is a fact, and an increasingly obvious fact also qualitatively, that we in the West, I say we because that includes Sweden, has been increasingly willing to render a military support, not troops on the ground, nor no-fly zones or Western planes flying the skies of Ukraine, fighting Russian planes, for example. Not that, but increasingly heavy and ambitious military equipment support plus financial support plus extending the sanctions on the other side. What is that but a proxy war, at least in the eyes of Russia, that we are actively involved in supporting, militarily support, the only restriction so far being boots on the ground and planes in the skies. So with this being the case, I think when Jens Stoltenberg and others, including our representatives, are discussing, so where are we now? What is the real risk of this escalating against our best wishes into something more concrete, going from proxy war to direct war between NATO and Russia? Then, of course, you have to look at the current situation, not just as a gray area, but also one where at least one could say that we are in a state of proxy war, actively militarily supporting one side in a European conflict, and what could come next in an action-reaction further process. And then commenting on your last point, I would also say that we have to remember concerning the atmosphere of gray area, atmosphere of crisis, and the daily press conferences, perhaps, that we, in addition to this geopolitical crisis, we are having, the world, in fact, having to deal with other crises.
Yeah.
The climate crisis, the migration crisis, financial crisis, what have you. There are other things to add on the list of crises, which are also part of the broader security crisis atmosphere and context that we are dealing with, necessitating, I also think, a more visible manifestation of this in terms of constant issues arising, with the vulnerability of modern society being built for so long on mechanisms like instant supplies from the world markets to our industries, etc., that are vulnerable in these various ways to these various crises. So it's a completely new context from the calm that we've seen so far.
I think that the hope we can have here is that the National Security Council, which is being created now or institutionalized in a more credible way in Sweden, might mean that we will have sort of more or less weekly and daily press briefings and information to the public putting everything into perspective, so to say, putting the entire spectrum of threats and opportunities into the security area into perspective. That is probably relatively low-hanging fruit, actually, if you think of the fact that Henrik Landerholm, who we both know as a very experienced experienced person, can at an early stage help to create a coherent picture of our security challenges, given the fact that we have converging crises, interrelated crises all over the place. And that would make it a little bit better, perhaps, than we had during the pandemic, where there was a tendency to see different things separately. So.
Yeah, and also the difference, I think, will be that in the context of Nordic cooperation, we are going to see much more coherence now than the strains provided by the pandemic, because that tended to split the Nordics into various interests and sub-interests, etc. So we're not going to see that. I have a final comment to all this, but please go ahead with this picture.
And I just wanted to say that when we talk about escalation horizontally in some way to the west, we have to also to remember that there are acute risks of escalation of the conflict to the east, because there is now very threatening language being used, for instance, by the Russian ambassador to Kazakhstan against Kazakhstan, talking about Nazis in this country, talking about the need for a special operation and so forth. So that's also very worrying from a Russian perspective. So because there is a military alliance, many people don't know about that it exists, but there is a CSTO alliance which includes Kazakhstan and some other countries over there, and Kazakhstan is an important country with a very large number of Russian-speaking people and large important resources. So escalation, we have already seen escalation before in Azerbaijan-Armenia case. That could very well be significant. We have had a war or a conflict recently between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where the leaders of those countries have lamented that the Russians have not been helpful. So there is a risk of implosion on that side as well.
And you have the Georgia inherited from 2008.
Yes, of course.
Of course.
And
then you have Belarus as a very important component to this whole thing.
And here is a strange thing. I wanted to actually finish for my part on this note that sometimes you would expect that those receiving the Peace Prize are people who try to calm down and reduce level of conflict and so forth. But in fact, we can say that this year's Peace Prize has been given to people who actually are bravely fighting for freedom, human rights, democracy, rule of law in their countries. I'm talking about Belarus, I'm talking about Russia, in a way which is perceived as a fight for regime change in these countries. I mean, clearly we are not talking about appeasement. We are talking about a very, very resolute support for what Ukraine is trying to achieve as well. So when you have that sentiment very clearly on the level of civil society, this obviously also is perceived on the Russian side as a factor of escalation, as a factor of threat, which is very central to the Russian even military doctrine, that color revolutions and so forth are very, very dangerous to systemic stability in Russia. So we are in a situation where there is a very, very strong support in Sweden for accession to NATO, very high, even in comparison with many NATO members. And there is also strong civil society support for a resolute support to Ukraine. So we have to expect that if we have that position, it will also cost in terms of potentially dramatic contradictions with the Russian interests.
Let me say then, as my final addition to this conversation, which I feel has been very useful, Lars-Erik, that we have to face the fact that we are, as I was trying to say in the beginning, in a situation where you can call it a gray area, but you can also point to, I think, the fact that no one really knows how to act in a more long-term fashion, because we are in an unknown territory, and hence the warning sounds from Jens Stoltenberg and others that now we cannot rule out rather nasty developments which will immediately affect us. Meanwhile, and since the war seems to be so lasting, because that's one of the reasons why we are saying that we don't know what the end game will be. And meanwhile, you could say also that our neighboring Baltic countries, they have been putting all their eggs in the deterrence basket. And for them, deterrence has been clearly stated to be that, to be saying openly that the only outcome of this is to defeat Russia. And if you take a long-term view on this and what this will mean in a long-term fashion, without regard to what will happen in the Kremlin, I think this is one of the parameters of a very lasting conflict. There are many others too with Russia, whether even if the armed war is somehow finding a way out or to be stalled or hindered. But I see a long stretch of a journey to find a new kind of sound stability in Europe, and relations with Baltic countries and Russia is just one of them. Another aspect here is you mentioned Poland here, and of course with Poland arming surprisingly quickly, but it is facing elections next fall. And then we'll see about the regime and what this regime change there might mean for relations not only between Brussels and Poland, but also between Poland and Germany. And there are signs of tension of a classical type between Poland and Germany, both arming quickly and also with relations with Hungary. So there are many developments with high risk components on both sides, you could say, of the divide. You mentioned those in the around Russia, and I'm now talking about the Western components, which adds to the feeling of great uncertainty as we move forward.
Yeah. So brace ourselves, be aware of the risks, trying to have as much overview as possible, I think would be necessary, and willing to pay our insurance premium for security in order to avoid horrendous costs when we lose control over the situation, as we almost did on energy the other day, day before yesterday, when we were importing equivalent of energy from 3 nuclear power stations from abroad. I mean, that was a close call, I must say. So maybe, Mika, we should stop on this note.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we will continue.